It was the summer of 1980. Inside the map room of the Soviet General Staff in Moscow, the mood was one of comfortable mathematical certainty. The men in this room did not deal in bullets or bombs. They dealt in time and distance. To a Soviet strategist, geography was destiny, and geography was on their side. They looked at the map of the world and saw a fundamental truth that comforted them. The United States was an island. A massive, powerful island, yes, but an island nonetheless. To fight a war in Europe or the Middle East, the Americans had to cross the Atlantic Ocean. 3,000 miles of water. To the Soviet mind, this was an insurmountable logistical wall. A senior Soviet logistician pointing at the blue expanse on the map might have smiled and explained the calculus of war to his subordinates. An army is heavy, well, I would say. A single tank division weighs thousands of tons. It requires fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and food. To move such a force across the ocean takes ships. Ships are slow. It takes weeks to load them, weeks to sail them, and weeks to unload them. If war breaks out in Germany or here in the Persian Gulf, the Americans will need 3 months to arrive in force. By the time their ships dock, our T-72s will already be parked in Paris or Riyadh. This was the tyranny of distance. The Soviets believed that time was their ally. Their army moved by rail. They had a direct, continuous land connection to potential battlefields. They could surge forces overnight. The Americans, they believed, were shackled by the speed of a cargo ship about 20 knots. This confidence led to a dangerous arrogance. The Kremlin believed that they could always dictate the tempo of a crisis. They could launch an invasion, achieve their objectives, and present the world with a fait accompli before the first American heavy tank could even be craned off a ship in a European port. They laughed at the idea of a rapid deployment force. In their eyes, rapid and heavy were mutually exclusive. You could fly light infantry quickly, sure, but light infantry against a Soviet tank division was just a speed bump. You could not fly an army. Physics didn't allow it. Or so they thought. They had watched the development of the American C-5 Galaxy in the late 1960s with skepticism. When the first photos of the massive aircraft appeared, the Soviet engineers were unimpressed. It was big, certainly. It was the largest aircraft in the world at the time. But to the Soviet military mind, it was a showpiece. It was a propaganda tool, a symbol of American excess, not a practical weapon of war. Look at the complexity, they scoffed. The nose opens up like a visor. The landing gear has 28 wheels and kneels like a camel. It is a maintenance nightmare. It will never work in a real crisis. It is too big, too fragile, and too expensive. They calculated that a fleet of such aircraft would be grounded by mechanical failures within days. They believed the Americans had built a white elephant, a beast that would consume its own weight in spare parts and fuel, achieving nothing but air show headlines. But while the Soviets were calculating the speed of ships, the U.S. Air Force was quietly rewriting the laws of logistics. They weren't building a plane. They were building a time machine. The C-5 Galaxy was designed to delete the Atlantic Ocean. The specifications of the aircraft were staggering, almost beyond comprehension. The cargo hold was longer than the Wright brothers' first flight. It was wide enough to hold a 6-lane bowling alley. But the most important metric wasn't size. It was capability. The C-5 was the only aircraft in the world capable of swallowing 2 M1 Abrams main battle tanks, or 6 Apache helicopters, or 250,000 pounds of cargo, and flying them 5,000 miles without refueling. The engineers at Lockheed had achieved this miracle by pushing the boundaries of aeronautical science to the breaking point. They developed the TF-39 high-bypass turbofan engine, a revolutionary power plant that screamed with a distinct banshee-like wail, a sound that would soon haunt the dreams of Soviet planners. They built a wing that was so flexible it flapped in turbulence like a bird, a terrifying sight to the uninitiated but essential to keep the massive structure from snapping. They created a pass-through cargo system where trucks could drive in the front and drive out the back, turning the aircraft into a flying tunnel. The C-5 was not a delicate instrument. It was a flying warehouse. It was an aluminum bridge that could stretch from Dover Air Force Base in Delaware to the sands of the Middle East in a single hop. The test of these two conflicting philosophies, the Soviet belief in the slow, inevitable sea bridge versus the American gamble on the air bridge, came on August 2, 1990. Saddam Hussein, the Soviet Union's erratic but heavily armed client, invaded Kuwait. His Republican Guard, equipped with thousands of T-72 tanks and supported by a dense air defense network, overran the small nation in hours. Saddam's eyes then turned south toward the oil fields of Saudi Arabia. If he took Saudi Arabia, he would control half the world's oil supply. He would hold the global economy hostage. In Baghdad, Saddam's Soviet-trained advisors were calm. They looked at their maps. They told Saddam he had nothing to worry about. The Americans are angry, Sawastu said, but they are far away. Their heavy armored divisions are in Texas and Germany. To bring them here will take months. They have to mobilize ships. They have to cross the ocean. By the time they arrive, we will be dug in. We will have the oil. We will dictate the terms. They were relying on the tyranny of distance. They believed they had a 3-month window of immunity. They envisioned the Americans panic-loading ships in slow motion. What they didn't see was the frantic activity at the Military Airlift Command headquarters in Illinois. The order had been given Operation Desert Shield. The goal was to move an entire army halfway around the world, not in months, but in hours. The aluminum cloud was mobilizing. At air bases across the United States, Dover, Travis, Westover, the sleeping giants were waking up. The crews of the C-5 Galaxies were sprinting to their aircraft. The characteristic whine of the TF-39 engines began to fill the air, a sound that started as a low moan and built to a deafening, earth-shaking scream. The sheer scale of the mobilization was unprecedented. It wasn't just military planes. The Air Force activated the Civil Reserve Air Fleet, drafting commercial airliners to carry troops. But the heavy lifting, the movement of the tanks, the artillery, the Patriot missile batteries, the things that actually stop an invasion, fell to the Galaxy. The Soviet intelligence satellites began to pick up thermal anomalies at U.S. air bases. The runways were glowing hot. The aircraft were taking off in streams, one every few minutes, forming a conga line of aluminum stretching across the Atlantic. On the ground in Saudi Arabia, at a remote airfield near Dhahran, the air traffic controllers watched their radar screens with disbelief. The scope was filling up with heavy contacts. They weren't fighters. They were heavy lifters. The first C-5 Galaxy call sign, Reach, appeared on the horizon. It looked like a building floating in the sky. It was a dark gray Leviathan blocking out the sun. It touched down its 28 wheels, smoking as they hit the hot tarmac. It taxied to the ramp, and before the engines had even spooled down, the massive visor nose began to lift. The ramp lowered. To the spies watching from the perimeter, what came out of the belly of that whale was a shock that shattered the Soviet worldview. It wasn't crates of rations. It wasn't light infantry with rifles. A massive 60-ton M1 Abrams tank roared down the ramp, its turbine engine whining in harmony with the jet. Then another. Then a self-propelled howitzer. Then a crate of Stinger missiles. The plane didn't shut down. It unloaded in 20 minutes, turned around, and took off again to get another load. And behind it, another C-5 was already landing. And another. The air bridge was open. The wall of the ocean had been breached. The Soviet generals had calculated that it was impossible to move an army by air. They were about to watch the United States do the impossible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The laughter in the Kremlin was about to turn into a cold realization their map was wrong. The Atlantic Ocean was not a barrier, it was a highway, and the traffic was moving at 500 miles per hour. The confrontation had begun not with a shot fired in anger, but with the screech of tires on a runway. The strategic calculus of the Cold War had just shifted. The Americans had proven they could be anywhere, and they brought their heavy metal with them. The landing of the first Galaxy was not the finish line. It was the starting gun of a logistical marathon that would break the back of the Soviet strategic calculus. For the next 6 months, the sky over the Atlantic Ocean was transformed into a conveyor belt of aluminum and jet fuel. The U.S. Air Force called it an air bridge, but to the exhausted crews flying the missions, it felt more like a steel river that never stopped flowing. The tempo was punishing. A C-5 would land in Dhahran, disgorge its cargo of 60 tons of ammunition, or a pair of Chinook helicopters refuel and take off again immediately, the crew sleeping in shifts in the cramped bunk beds above the cargo hold. They flew until the wings cracked and the engines screamed in protest. The scale of the operation was something the world had never seen, and something the Soviet planners had deemed mathematically impossible. In the span of a few weeks, the Military Airlift Command moved the equivalent of a small American city, its people, its vehicles, its food, and its weapons halfway around the globe. The statistics were numbing. At the height of the operation, a transport plane was landing in Saudi Arabia every 7 minutes, 24 hours a day. The air traffic controllers were overwhelmed, stacking giant aircraft in holding patterns that stretched for hundreds of miles. The distinct, high-pitched whine of the C-5's TF-39 engines became the soundtrack of the desert, a banshee wail that announced the arrival of yet another nail in the coffin of the Iraqi army. But the operation was not without its crises. The C-5 Galaxy was a technological marvel, but it was also a temperamental beast. It was arguably the most complex aircraft ever built with millions of parts, and in the brutal heat of the Arabian summer, things began to break. The hydraulic systems essential for kneeling the landing gear and opening the massive visor nose leaked fluid onto the hot tarmac. The avionics overheated. The engines ingested sand. The maintenance crews worked in temperatures reaching 120 degrees, their hands blistering as they touched the metal skin of the aircraft, fighting a desperate war against entropy to keep the fleet flying. The Soviet intelligence analysts watching this struggle from Moscow likely felt a flicker of hope. They saw the maintenance reports. They saw the Hangar Queen's aircraft grounded for parts. They predicted that the surge would collapse under its own weight. "The American machine is too delicate," they whispered. "It cannot sustain this pace. The chain will break." But they underestimated the ingenuity of the American mechanic. When parts weren't available, the crews improvised. When systems failed, they flew anyway. The C-5s flew with systems bypassed, with warnings taped over, pushed by a singular driving purpose. They weren't just moving cargo. They were racing against time to save the lives of the light infantry units digging into the sand at the front lines. In Baghdad, the mood in the presidential palace shifted from arrogance to a cold, creeping dread. Saddam Hussein and his generals had been promised a 3-month window of immunity. They had planned their strategy based on the assumption that the Americans would need 90 days to assemble a credible attack force. But every time they looked at the satellite photos or listened to the reports from their spies near the air bases, they saw the impossible happening. The American army wasn't arriving in months. It was arriving in hours. The desert shield was hardening into a desert storm right before their eyes. The cargo that rolled out of the C-5s was specifically chosen to counter the Soviet-supplied advantages of the Iraqi army. The Iraqis had thousands of tanks. The C-5s brought the M1 Abrams and the AH-64 Apache helicopters to hunt them. The Iraqis had a massive artillery advantage. The C-5s brought the MLRS rocket systems and the counter-battery radars to silence them. But perhaps the most critical cargo wasn't a weapon at all. It was the logistics themselves. The C-5s brought the forklifts, the fuel trucks, the water purification units, and the spare parts that allowed the coalition forces to operate in the desert. This was the iceberg theory of warfare that the Soviets had neglected. They focused on the tip of the iceberg, the tanks and guns, while the Americans focused on the massive, invisible structure of logistics that kept the tip floating. The C-5 Galaxy allowed the U.S. military to bypass the tyranny of distance and project power directly into the enemy's backyard. It turned the entire planet into a single theater of operations. A tank factory in Ohio was now effectively connected to the front line in Kuwait by a 500-mile-per-hour tunnel. By January 1991, the buildup was complete. The aluminum cloud had deposited over 500,000 tons of cargo and hundreds of thousands of troops into the theater. The Iraqi generals who had been confident in August were now staring at a force that was technologically superior, fully supplied, and ready to strike. The C-5 Galaxy had denied them their greatest ally time. They had expected a slow, grinding buildup that would give them time to negotiate or to fracture the coalition politically. Instead, they faced a sudden, overwhelming accumulation of combat power. The window had slammed shut, but the Galaxy had one more role to play: a secret mission that would facilitate the greatest tactical deception since the Trojan horse. As the air war began and the eyes of the world were fixed on the skies over Baghdad, the C-5s and their smaller cousins, the C-130s, began a frantic, stealthy shuffle inside Saudi Arabia. They weren't just bringing supplies in, they were moving them sideways. General Norman Schwarzkopf had devised a plan to outflank the Iraqi army, the famous left hook. He needed to move an entire corps of troops and tanks hundreds of miles to the west into the empty desert to strike the Iraqis from behind. This required a logistical miracle. It meant building a new city in the middle of nowhere, unseen by the enemy. The C-5s flew night after night, landing on improvised airstrips, delivering the fuel bladders and ammunition dumps that would feed the flank attack. The Iraqis, blinded by the destruction of their air defense radars, had no idea that the hammer was being moved to their blind side. They were still watching the sea, waiting for the amphibious assault that would never come, while the C-5s were helping to position the knife at their ribs. When the ground war finally started, the Soviet advisors were stunned not just by the ferocity of the American attack, but by its direction. They came from the empty quarter, a captured Iraqi general would later lament. No army can move through that desert. It is a logistical impossibility. He was right. For a Soviet army tethered to rail lines and slow supply trucks, it was impossible. But for an army supported by the C-5 Galaxy, the impossible was just a matter of flight schedules. The massive planes had turned the vast, hostile desert into a chessboard where the Americans could move their pieces anywhere, anytime. The end of the war brought the final validation of the airlifters' dominance. As the Iraqi army retreated along the highway of death, abandoning thousands of vehicles that had run out of fuel and ammunition, the American forces pursuing them were flush with supplies. The contrast was stark. The Soviet doctrine of mass had failed because mass without movement is just a target. The American doctrine of velocity, moving the right things to the right place at the right time, had triumphed. The C-5 Galaxy was the engine of that velocity. In the aftermath, military strategists in Moscow and Beijing were forced to tear up their textbooks. They realized that the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were no longer defensive moats. They were highways. If the United States could move an army to the Middle East in weeks, It could move an army anywhere. The concept of strategic depth, the idea that you could be safe because you were far away, was dead. The roar of the TF-39 engine was a message to every potential adversary: distance will not save you. The aluminum river had done more than just deliver cargo. It had delivered a geopolitical shockwave. It proved that the superpower with the best logistics is the superpower that dictates the rules of the game. The C-5 Galaxy, the plane the Soviets laughed at for being a maintenance nightmare and a white elephant, had proven to be the workhorse of the apocalypse. It was ugly, it was loud, and it leaked hydraulic fluid, but it had carried the weight of the free world on its flexible wings and delivered it right to the enemy's doorstep. The laughter in the Kremlin was gone, replaced by a sobering question that haunts military planners to this day. How do we fight an enemy that can move a mountain overnight? The answer, as they looked at the smoking ruins of the Iraqi war machine, was terrifyingly simple. You can't. You can only watch as the mountain falls on you. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 did not end the rivalry of the giants. It merely shifted the battlefield from ideology to engineering. The Soviets, stinging from the logistical humiliation of the Cold War, had attempted to answer the challenge of the galaxy with a titan of their own, the Antonov An-124 Ruslan. On paper, the Ruslan was a monster. It was slightly larger than the C-5, could carry a heavier payload, and was designed with a ruggedness that allowed it to operate from rough frozen airstrips in Siberia. The Soviet engineers pointed to the An-124 with pride, claiming they had finally surpassed the Americans in the art of heavy lift. But while the machine was impressive, the system behind it was broken. The C-5 Galaxy was part of a global integrated network of bases, tankers, and maintenance depots that spanned the planet. The An-124 was an orphan of a dying empire. When the Soviet Union dissolved, the production lines in Ukraine and Russia were severed, and the fleet fell into disrepair. The Americans had built a logistical ecosystem. The Soviets had built a few magnificent, lonely beasts. As the 21st century dawned, the C-5 Galaxy faced its own existential crisis. The fleet was aging. The TF-39 engines, once revolutionary, were now loud, inefficient, and unreliable. The scream that had terrified the Iraqis was becoming a maintenance headache that grounded the fleet too often. The Pentagon faced a choice: retire the old warhorse and rely on the smaller C-17 Globemaster, or double down on the giant. They looked at the geopolitical map. They saw the rise of China, the chaos in the Middle East, and the resurgence of Russian aggression. They realized that the need to move heavy armor, the M1 Abrams tanks and the Bradleys, was more critical than ever. The C-17 could carry one tank. The C-5 could carry two. In the math of war, volume is king. So the Air Force launched the most ambitious modernization program in history, the C-5M Super Galaxy. They ripped the heart out of the old bird and replaced it. The screaming TF-39s were swapped for General Electric CF6 engines, the same massive, reliable turbofans used on Air Force One and commercial airliners. The result was shocking. The new engines gave the Galaxy 22% more thrust and a 30% shorter takeoff roll. The aluminum cloud had been given a steroid injection. In a series of record-breaking flights, the C-5M shattered 41 world aviation records in a single week. It carried payloads that would crush a lesser aircraft to altitudes where the air was thin and cold, proving that the 50-year-old design was not just alive, but stronger than ever. The roar was gone, replaced by a deep, powerful hum, but the message to the world remained the same. The United States can move a mountain, and now it can do it faster, quieter, and with less fuel. The true test of this reborn giant came not in a theoretical war game, but in the frantic, desperate evacuation of Kabul in 2021. As the Taliban swept through Afghanistan, the C-5s were called upon to perform a mission they were never designed for a humanitarian airlift of biblical proportions. The cavernous cargo holds, usually filled with tanks and helicopters, were packed with human beings. In one flight, a C-5M carried over 800 Afghan refugees to safety. The aircraft that was built to deliver death was now the ultimate ark of life. It was a poignant reminder of the dual nature of American power. The same logistics that can crush an army can also save a population. The sheer volume of the galaxy allowed the U.S. to evacuate over 100,000 people in a matter of days, a feat that no other nation on Earth could even attempt. But history is a circle, and the C-5 has now returned to its original mission, confronting Russian armor in Europe. As the war in Ukraine erupted in 2022, the air bridge was reactivated. The destination was not Saudi Arabia, but Rzeszów in Poland. The cargo was not for American troops, but for the Ukrainian army fighting for its survival. The C-5Ms began to land in Eastern Europe, their noses opening to reveal the arsenal of democracy. HIMARS rocket launchers, M777, howitzers, Bradley fighting vehicles, and millions of rounds of ammunition. The Russian generals watching from Moscow must have felt a familiar, sickening sense of déjà vu. Once again, their strategy of mass and attrition was being undermined by American logistics. They were trying to grind Ukraine down, but the C-5s were refilling the Ukrainian magazines faster than the Russians could empty them. The irony is palpable. The C-5 Galaxy was designed in the 1960s specifically to fight the Soviet Union. It spent the Cold War waiting for the order to fly to Germany. It spent the 1990s dismantling the Soviet client state in Iraq. And now, in the twilight of its career, it is finally doing exactly what it was built to do, killing Russian tanks on the plains of Europe, not by firing shots, but by delivering the weapons that do. The An-124 Ruslan, the Soviet rival, is also flying in this war, but often carrying supplies for a Russian army that is poorly equipped and struggling with logistics. The American plane brings precision weapons and hope. The Russian plane brings outdated gear to a demoralized force. The contest between the two giants has been settled by history. One is the backbone of a global alliance. The other is a beast of burden for a pariah state. The legacy of the C-5 Galaxy is not just in the tonnage it has moved, but in the psychological effect it has on the world. It represents the long arm of the United States. There is no place on the planet that is safe from American power because there is no place the C-5 cannot reach. It has shrunk the globe. It has deleted the oceans. It has turned the tyranny of distance into the luxury of reach. When a dictator considers invading a neighbor, he has to look at the stopwatch. He has to ask himself, can I win before the galaxies arrive? And for 50 years, the answer has almost always been no. The Soviet generals who laughed at the map in 1980 are long gone. Their empire dissolved, their doctrine discredited. But the machine they mocked is still flying. It is still screaming across the Atlantic, its wings flexing in the wind, carrying the weight of the world in its belly. It is ugly, it is massive, and it is undeniable. In the end, the Cold War wasn't won by the fastest jet or the biggest bomb. It was won by the country that could build a flying warehouse and keep it flying day after day, decade after decade. The laughter has stopped. The map has changed. But the aluminum river keeps flowing, and as long as it does, the enemies of the West will always be looking over their shoulders, waiting for the sound of the giant arriving at their doorstep.